Thank you again for joining me today at today's Lunch and Learn talk with local scholar Ted Dyer. We will look under the surface at Indian Camp, the first of 3 thematically linked Nick Adams stories by Ernest Hemingway. Over the next 2 weeks, he'll examine The Battler, followed by Big Two-Hearted River. I also want to give a big shout out to the Idaho Humanities Council who funded this series of 3 talks. The Idaho Humanities Council is a nonprofit organization that serves as the state-based partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. So a big thanks to them. Our friend Ted received his MA in English from Washington State University and taught 20 years as a composition instructor for the College of Southern Idaho Extension Service in Blaine County, Idaho. For several years, he taught literature and jazz history for the Idaho State University Department of Continuing Education. He has also worked for decades as a speaker for the Idaho Humanities Speakers Bureau and is a recognized speaker on the life and works of Ernest Hemingway. And I also just like to feature a book that we have at the library, Ernest Hemingway, the Nick Adams story. So if you want to read the whole series of stories, Ted's just going to pick out 3 particular ones. You can check that out.
Well, thank you for being an audience. Talking to the camera by myself would get awful lonesome. But anyway, this is the first of the Nick Adams stories, and it was also the second of Hemingway's modernist stories. Hemingway arrived in Paris in December of 2021, and he'd left most of the fiction he'd written back in the Midwest when he came to Paris. And he was kind of nervous about this prose fiction thing, so he kind of decided he'd rather be a poet. Now that didn't work out so well, but his wife liked his poems. Nonetheless, he was a lifelong writer. He knew from his childhood days, I think he wrote his first story when he was 3. He was one of those blessed individuals to have a real sense of destiny. He started, and he always knew he would be a writer. He wrote fiction, and he wrote all kinds of things for his school newspaper. But before he got to Paris, the people he admired were people you probably wouldn't know about, people like Ring Lardner and O. Henry and Rudyard Kipling. He wrote a lot of stories after he got back home from the war in a kind of rollicking adventure mode, none of them which got published. He wrote a lot of things and got a lot of rejection slips. But somehow, in some way, it all came together for him in 1924. And I always say in my talks that everybody should have a year like Hemingway had in 1924. Suddenly, as a very young man, he became a modernist writer. And all his work, all his thinking, and all his planning finally came to fruition. And this story, Indian Camp, although it's the second he wrote in the modernist mode, it's his very first Nick Adams story, and one of his most famous and one of his most revered. So this is the start of a long sequence of stories he wrote about a character called Nick Adams. And he wrote various stories at various times. He didn't write them in chronological order, but this one was the first, and it was really the first in a lot of ways. So what we have here also, I'll talk a little bit about this, is the emergence of Hemingway as a prose stylist. He was the first person his style was quite striking and original, and it was recognized as such from the start. For all of us won't experience the shock of the new, which is what his readers experienced. And what we got is a brand new approach to the short story in a brand new style. Now, short stories in the past had largely been stories that other writers had abandoned, had been little bits and pieces that people left in file cabinets, and they were very rarely these sort of vignettes. Hemingway's short stories were more like poems than they were like short stories, and they were more concerned with the lyrical moment than they were with a narrative. So this is a whole new approach to the short story, and it was recognized pretty early. Anyway, I'll get to the story. Indian Camp starts off, and since I gather we haven't had a chance to read this story, or at least reread it recently, so I'll give you a little aid here to, I lost my clock. Rats. Anyway, I should have brought my own cell phone, but I didn't. So I'll ask you occasionally for the time. I don't want to detain you at great lengths. So anyway, I'll just start off at the start so we can get going into the story. The first thing Hemingway cut this down. He had a thing called the theory of omission, or what he later called his iceberg theory. And there was an opening portion that he was originally part of the story called 3 shots. And he chopped this part out of the story, and I'll refer to that in a second. But at the Indian camp starts out, at the lakeshore, there was another rowboat drawn up. The 2 Indians stood waiting. Nick and his father got in the stern of the boat, and the Indian shoved it off, and one of them got in to row. Uncle George sat in the stern of the camp rowboat. The young Indian showed the camp boat off and got in to row Uncle George. The 2 boats started off in the dark. Nick heard the oarlocks of the other boat quite a way ahead of them in the mist. The Indians rowed with quick, choppy strokes. Nick lay back with his father's arm around him. It was cold on the water. The Indian who was rowing them was working very hard, but the other boat moved farther ahead in the mist all the time. Now, this is a very unliterary language. This is what I call everyday words. There's not a word in this story that a 5th grader couldn't understand. We don't have literary diction. We don't have artsy prose. We don't have what we used to call fine writing. And there are very few modifiers, that is to say verbs or adverbs, and very few, adverbs and adjectives, and there are very few snazzy verbs. And lots of people have trouble with this because they expect, well, they're being cheated. This is dull, I can do this. And lots of times people plow through these stories like they're reading newspaper stories. There's kind of a sense in which they don't seem to be literary in the least. But of course, that's part of the effect. Also, his style has to do with his bare bones and sentence grammar. The key to Hemingway is his sentence rhythm, and that's what makes his prose style. He communicates more meaning through the rhythm of the sentence than he does by what is being told. And his narrators, by the way, we have what in the literature biz, we have an omniscient narrator. This narrator is really kept on a tight chain. There's no sense that this narrator is going to tell you his opinions. He's going to show rather than tell. And if you ever read old 19th century stuff, the narrator is sort of like a gabby uncle at Thanksgiving. He's someone who knows everything, tells you what you should know, what you should think, blah, blah. Hemingway's narrators are just give you the absolute minimum. So anyway, I was just curious about this story. Where are we going, Dad? Nick asked. Over to the Indian camp. There's an Indian lady very sick. Oh, said Nick. So, actually, he's communicated a lot to us already. One of the interesting things is about this story, and in the Nick Adams story as a whole, Hemingway wrote about the native peoples quite extensively. But this is the only story in which the Indians don't speak. There's almost no conversation in this story. The only people are doing the talking are Nick and his father. This is very interesting. So I'll come back to that in a second. This has been, of course, a very famous and popular story, but it's also been a very controversial story in recent years. This has become to be seen as kind of an extinction narrative. And Dr. Adams has taken quite a lot of heavy criticism for his conduct. So does everybody here know what happened in the story? Okay. Well, I'll keep going. Across the bay, they found the other boat beached. Uncle George, That's Nick's Uncle George, Dr. Adams' brother, Dr. Henry Adams. If there was ever an American name, I don't know what it would be. There was actually, of course, a real Henry Adams. He was, I believe, the grandson of the second president of the United States. And there's a kind of a sense in which he is kind of an Adam. Across the bay, they found the other boat beached. Uncle George was smoking a cigar in the dark. The young Indian pulled the boat up, way up the beach. Uncle George gave both the Indians cigars. They walked up from the beach through a meadow that was soaking wet with dew, following the young Indians who carried a lantern. Then they went into the woods and followed a trail that led to the logging road that ran back into the hills. It was much lighter on the logging road as the timber was cut away on both sides. The young Indian stopped and blew out his lantern, and they all walked on along the road. So they came around a bend, and a dog came out barking. Ahead were the lights of the shanties where the Indian bark peelers lived. What's a bark peeler? Anybody have an idea what a bark peeler is? Yeah, they would cut this. The text of this volume shows birch bark. The Ojibwe Indians and a lot of those North American Indians used to do this. They would cover canoes with it. They would make baskets, and they also made a lot of artifacts they sold to white tourists who came north. This is also a function of northern Michigan. Northern Michigan was a famous resort spot. The Great Lakes, all kinds of people came up the Mississippi River to vacation and have their summer cabins. And also there was a very robust logging industry. And by the way, and in some senses, the logging industry is almost the star of the Nick Adams short stories, as we'll see in subsequent stories. More dogs rushed out at them. The two Indians sent them back to the shanties. In the shanty nearest the road, there was a light in the window. An old woman stood in the doorway holding a lamp. Inside in a wooden bunk lay a young Indian woman. She had been trying to have her baby for 2 days. And of course there's her husband. She screamed just as Nick and the two Indians followed his father and Uncle George into the shanty. She lay in the lower bunk, very big under a quilt. Her head was turned to one side, and the upper bunk was her husband. He had cut his foot very badly with an axe 3 days before. He was smoking a pipe. The room smelled very bad. So I was just curious, to me, what's the tone of this? Yeah, it's thank you very much. Yeah, so our audience member just said doom and gloom. There's foreboding for sure, and there's a sense to me that this is kind of like an adventure gone bad. To set the scene a bit, Dr. Henry Adams is a doctor. He's what now in common parlance we would call a first responder. And in a pre-automobile day, now remember, if this would transpire sometime in the first decade of the 20th century. And how old do you think Nick is? Very young. I would say Nick is 4, 5, 6, something like that. And if Dr. Adams and Nick are biographically connected to his creator, that would put this story in 1905, 1906, somewhere there. And I always, when I think of Dr. Adams, and really he's an exemplary model of what we would call a first responder. He's someone who, in a large respect, embodies the values of the doctor in that day. Hemingway's father, go ahead.
So where do you get the information that Nick is so young?
The way he talks.
Okay, at first I was thinking like a 10-year-old.
Could be. I always thought younger because of his language. Now when we get to, and yeah, the age of Nick is, to me, he's under 10 because he calls him Daddy. Here at the very end of the story, do ladies always have such a hard time having babies? Nick asked. No, that was very, very exceptional. Why did he kill himself, Daddy? I don't know, Nick. He couldn't stand things, I guess. Do many men kill themselves, Daddy? Not very many, Nick. Do many women? Hardly ever. Don't they ever? Oh, yes, they do sometimes. Daddy? Yes. Where did Uncle George go? He'll turn up all right. Is dying hard, Daddy? That seems to me like that's a younger child. So this is going to be, obviously this is the first Nick Adams story. This is Nick Adams' story, although you wouldn't know that the first time you read it. And in fact, modern readers don't see it as a Nick Adams story at all. They see it as a plight of the native people's story. And the fact that Nick is here, and it's his story, is indicative. We're going to, as we read these Nick Adams stories, see how these kinds of experiences accumulate in Nick's psyche, how it shapes his emerging mind. So, yeah, it's pretty foreboding. And all of a sudden, you think about even what it would be like for a doctor. He's in his buggy, in this case in a canoe. He might have his black bag, and he's rowing to someplace he doesn't know to work on someone he hasn't met, and he doesn't know what's going to happen. You know, just think of the thousands of country doctors who were in that situation over the years. Also, one of the things that's interesting about this that Uncle George and Dr. Adams were on a camping trip in the northern reaches of Michigan. They weren't in their home, their summer home in Walloon Lake, which is much farther south near the Great Lakes. This is set in the very upper regions of northern Michigan, and this particular Indian tribe is one that's had very limited contact with white Americans. Now, there's several Nick Adams short stories, many of which deal with native peoples, and all of those peoples, all of those stories feature Indians that have some command of the English language. What's interesting and distinctive here is none of the native peoples speak English. In fact, there's no dialogue at all with anybody except Nick and Dr. Adams. That's a very interesting and subtle feature which gives shape and focus to their relationship and focuses all kinds of things on Nick and his dad. So, anyway, I was curious about Uncle George and his cigars. What's he doing handing out a cigar? Well, it's a nice thing to do. It was also, if I recall, you know, nowadays giving tobacco on any occasion is forbidden. But back in the day, you know, people used to hand out cigars when a child was born. And that's what Uncle George is doing. But, you know, doesn't seem like a very festive moment. Uncle George turns out to be famous for his inappropriate behavior. He also curses, you know, by the standards of the day, he curses quite a bit. And then, of course, finally here, what we see is Nick's father is ordering some water to be put on the stove. Notice there's no dialogue. He ordered some water to be put on the stove, and while it was heating, he spoke to Nick. The lady is going to have a baby, Nick, he said. I know, said Nick. You don't know, said his father. Listen to me. What she's going through is called being in labor. The baby wants to be born, and she wants it to be born. And he goes on here to say, just then the woman cried out. And this was one of the first famous moments in the story. Oh, Daddy, can't you give her something to make her stop screaming? Asked Nick. No, I haven't any anesthetic, his father said, but her screams are not important. I don't hear them because they are not important. The husband in the upper bunk rolled over against the wall. Now this gets Dr. Adams in all kinds of trouble. A, why doesn't he have any anesthetic? Anybody have any idea? Is he a bad doctor? Shouldn't he be better prepared?
Well, I don't think they carried it in their little black bags back in the day.
Well, yeah. First, I'm sure Dr. Adams had a lot more medical equipment at his summer home. Remember, he's on a fishing trip with Uncle George and Nick in the northernmost parts of Michigan. He's not going to have much. He's not going to have any medical equipment at all, I would presume. And I'm not sure what constituted anesthetic in the first decade of the 20th century. But, so that's the first thing that happens. And of course, the woman's screams are not important. I don't hear them because they are not important. By the way, those are classic Hemingway sentences. He repeats the phrase, not important. So does that mean he's callously indifferent to the sufferings of this troubled woman trying to give birth?
No, it means giving birth is the important part. The screams of the pain are not.
Yeah, and as this fine gentleman says, the issue here is going to be on the doctor focusing. It's called, you know, he can't afford to indulge himself in the emotions of the things. Now, the story says the screams are so disturbing that many of the Indian men in the village stayed away. They sat smoking in the dark. And by the way, oddly enough, Uncle George smokes in the dark too. Well, I was going to ask, why are we linking George to the Indians? And just imagine a scream that would be so frightening that people would recoil and leave. So Dr. Adams has to focus. I think at this moment when he hears those screams, he realizes for the first time perhaps the gravity of the situation, and he has to focus on the patient to the exclusion of any distractions. He can't allow himself an emotional reaction to the screams of the patient. And this is how doctors and medical people are trained. Now, I don't know that this shows anything other than simply his duty as a physician, but there are people who read this story and say this is a man who has a callous disregard for this woman. But I'm here to defend Dr. Adams. The woman in the kitchen motioned to the doctor that the water was hot. Now that's of course, the famous sentence, the husband in the upper bunk rolled over against the wall. Now, what does that mean? What is the husband's reaction? Is he responding to what exactly? The standard interpretation is that the husband in the bunk has heard Dr. Adams say something that has upset him, and he rolls over. But it's very curious to me. I don't know that this father understands English at all. In the next sentence, the woman in the kitchen motioned to the doctor that the water was hot. Now, she doesn't speak English. In all the other Nick Adams stories, especially the ones centered around Wallow Lake, Indians speak English, at least to some extent. When they don't, like in The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife, there's a character called Billy Tabashaw, and the narrator tells us that Billy doesn't speak English. But all the other Indians there speak English. And by the way, in all the other stories, the Indians are represented as individual people with individual names. Dr. Adams treats everybody, white and Indian alike. So that's one of the aspects that's never talked about, is that these are people in the very farthest reaches of the United States, and it doesn't appear that they speak English. So Dr. Adams has even more trouble. He's working on someone who he can't communicate with. So I'm curious about this husband and why he turned over in the upper bunk. Anybody have any ideas? Yes, ma'am.
My thought is that I'm not sure if he can even understand what Doc said, but he's hearing his wife scream. He's injured. He can't do anything. And so by turning away, he's kind of blocking that out of his mind, that's the only way he can cope with the situation.
Yeah. His smoking in the dark is interesting. All these people that smoke, by the way, smoking in the dark is a strange thing because you can't see the smoke. Isn't the purpose of smoking seeing the smoke? But he says smoking in the dark. And all these are Indians. These people that smoke, especially people that smoke in the dark, are people who want to flee. They don't want any part of this. This is horrifying. But anyway, it's quite possible, I think, that he's distraught. He's been, yeah, right, you're right. The Indian father has been listening to these screams, and they've got to have an effect on him. But also, the tone of the doctor's voice, the presence of people like this, and maybe the tone of the voice, maybe the sound of spoken English, maybe there's something. Clearly, he's upset in some way. But I don't know that this can be attributed to Dr. Adams. Maybe it's the commotion. Anyway, there's a very interesting thing, the way in the next paragraph that Dr. Adams meticulously washes his hands. You see, Nick, babies are supposed to be born head first, but sometimes they're not. When they're not, they make a lot of trouble for everybody. Maybe I'll have to operate on this lady. I'll know in a little while. When he was satisfied with his hands, he went in and went to work. Pull back that quilt, will you, George? He said. I'd rather not touch it. Later, when he started to operate, Uncle George and the 3 Indian men held the woman still. She bit Uncle George on the arm, and Uncle George said, "Damn squaw bitch." And the young Indian who had rowed Uncle George over laughed at him. Nick held the basin for his father. It all took a long time. Now, this is also a controversial moment, this sort of outburst, that sort of racist kind of, this squab, that sort of thing. For critics of the Adams family, and of Uncle George in particular, this is a low moment. Why is he responding like this? Anybody have any ideas? What's Uncle George doing in this story? And that's one of the things that I think I'll just tell you, since I only have an hour and I don't know what time it is. What time is it, by the way? Ooh, I'm going to get with the program here. And Uncle George is the foil to Dr. Adams. A foil. He's the opposite of. As Dr. Adams' opposite, they're brothers, which is to say it's two sides of the same coin, to switch the metaphor, but he's someone who Dr. Adams would never use a curse word. He's a very proper Victorian man. And he doesn't refer to Indians as squaws, and he wouldn't even think of considering using.
They're a lady.
Yeah, exactly.
Right there.
Sure. So this is to highlight the fact that Dr. Adams, as a first responder, has a perfectly professional attitude to this situation, and he treats all patients the same. Also, he's, as you'll see in the other short stories, he's happy to work with the native peoples all the time. He's the people but how did they come to him? Where did they find Dr. Adams and Uncle George? They somehow, in some way, first of all, the Indian peoples in here are quite intrepid in their solutions. Once their midwives can't help, they track down Dr. Adams in the depths of the northern Michigan woods and bring him here. So there's a lot to be said for the solidarity and ingenuity of these people, the native peoples in this story. But Uncle George does all the bad things that Dr. Adams would never think of doing. And in other stories, there are other white people who talk disparagingly of native peoples. But nobody in the Adams family does. It's very interesting. Okay, it all took a long time. His father picked the baby up and slapped it to make it breathe and handed it to the old woman. "See, it's a boy," he said. "How do you like being an intern?" Nick said, "All right." He was looking away so as not to see what his father was doing. "There, that gets it," said his father, and he put something into the basin. First of all, there's no drama surrounding the birth of the child. That's all gone. He writes that out of the story completely. This is not a story about birth. This is a story really kind of about life and death and how they're intertwined. And this is a way in which these terrible situations can just pop up at any moment. "That gets it. There, that gets it," said his father, and put something into the basin. What's the something? Anybody, any idea? I'm assuming it's afterbirth. It's afterbirth. I'm assuming it's something having, you know, it's some of the leftover biological materials from the cesarean section he has just performed. Now, his father said, there's some stitches to put in. You can watch this or not, Nick, just as you like. I'm going to sew up the incision I made. Nick did not watch. His curiosity had been gone for a long time. His father finished and stood up. Uncle George and the...
Doing this without anesthetic or any pain numbing or anything.
Absolutely.
Poor woman.
Absolutely. So that's what's happening here, and in terms of this is what's frightening about this situation. I'll get some peroxide on that, George, the doctor said. Here's a very interesting moment. Uncle George looked at his arm. The Indian smiled reminiscently. The only thing that Uncle George cares about is his arm. Uncle George doesn't seem to be he doesn't seem to have a lot of real concern about what's this is someone who just kind of doesn't get it. He's someone who doesn't understand the gravity of the situation. He probably doesn't understand the full humanity of these people, and he's just as soon get this over with. I'll be back in the morning, the doctor said, standing up. The nurse should be here from St. Ignace by noon, and she'll bring everything we need. This is Hemingway telling us that he understands, that the doctor knows that he came here without the right materials. But interestingly enough, he saved their lives anyway. We have another father and another son. So we have a pairing of fathers and sons. You get two for the price of one in this story. That's one for the medical journal, George, he said. Doing a cesarean with a jackknife and sewing it up with 9-foot tapered gut leaders. That's fishing line. He sewed her up with fishing line. So is this, what's going on with the doctor here? Is he being callous? Is he just being dismissive? Is he bragging about what he did as if this were some sort of exercise in medical school? Go ahead, sir.
That's all he had.
Well, yeah, that's all he had. And he has to get by with what he has to get by with. So also, there is, Uncle George was standing up against the wall. Oh, you're a great man, all right, he said. Anyway, he said that's one for the medical journals. And I checked this out. There's one of the literary critics who wrote, he said that the first cesarean section performed in America was done so in 1894. So the fact that Dr. Adams could perform a cesarean in the woods of northern Michigan with fishing gear is testament to his abilities and his resourcefulness. And also, he feels exhilaration. I'm sure he felt relief that he did what he was supposed to do. This is a great moment for him. But is he callously bragging about this? I don't know. I think also he's trying, to work the room. He's trying to diffuse the intense emotions of the moment. So he's here he feels relief, and he's happy, and he feels he did a good job. And maybe it is one for the medical journals. If they'd only been doing cesareans for a little over 10 years, I'd bet this might well be the first one done in the backwoods. Who knows? So, Uncle George against the wall. Here's another moment that gets Dr. Adams in trouble. Ought to have a look at the proud father. They're usually the worst sufferers at these little affairs, the doctor said. I must say he took it all pretty quietly. Now, what's the tone of this? Is he being condescending? It's an interesting question. This is another one that gets Dr. Adams in a lot of trouble. Of course, there's a lot of irony. I must say he took it pretty quietly. Yeah, he was dead. He pulled the blanket from the Indian's head. Just when you thought it was bad, it gets worse. His hand came away wet. That's a great sentence. He mounted on the edge of the lower bunk with a lamp in one hand and looked in. The Indian lay with his face toward the wall. His throat had been cut from ear to ear. The blood had flowed down into a pool where his body sagged the bunk. His head rested on his left arm. The open razor lay edge up in the blankets. Take Nick out of the shanty, George, the doctor said. So, this other father doesn't do so well. First of all, obviously he commits suicide. First of all, just think about that. What it would take to slit your own throat. I mean, that's ferocious. Also, I've always been intrigued. What's he doing? He seems to have a razor in the bunk and nothing else. Now, as the lawyers like to say, well, that's indicative of intent, isn't it? The standard sort of like post-colonial reading is that he killed himself because he couldn't, bear what happened to his wife. But why did he bring a razor to his bunk? It turns out that there's a whole lot about this Indian father we don't know besides his name. The Indian father, of course, doesn't speak like any of the other, any of the other natives in this story. So it's been, lots of people have come up with a lot of bad things to say about Dr. Adams because of the fate of the father. But I've often wondered, first of all, I mean, if you're in the very, very northern reaches of northern Michigan, upper Michigan, I mean, would a straight razor be hard to come by? Maybe you could get one on your travels. I don't know, but it seems very odd to get, yes, sir, go ahead.
That's how they used to shave.
Oh, of course, he says that's how they used to shave. That's naturally, but what I'm saying is that,
Didn't though, generally.
well, I was often, this is, see, we're getting it, how,
I was just wondering, maybe he had it because there was some trading going on if they were out in, where you say they're at.
yeah. He might have bartered for one, to be sure.
There was some trading going on.
But I'm not so sure that, I can't help but wonder why he brought that with him.
To bed.
Yeah, to bed. How many bring a straight razor to bed? Yeah, so there's something going on. I'm saying there's something about this man's life that he was close to the edge anyway. Also, his foot is badly cut. The room smells. That would be suggestive of gangrene. Interesting thing, though, the narrator of this story doesn't tell us anything about his medical condition. There's a doctor in the room. Should the doctor have attended to his leg? There's all kinds of questions, and this Indian father is kind of out of focus. But his plight, and of course the plight of his infant son, we can compare Nick Adams to this newborn Indian boy, and we would probably not be able to compare them too favorably. I would suggest that Nick Adams is the doctor's son of a prominent Chicago area family, has a great many better prospects than this young, now fatherless Indian boy. However, both mother and son are doing fine. Dr. Adams, is going to arrange for a nurse to come to this distant outpost. So he's very conscious and aware of what needs to be done procedurally and what equipment needs to come there. I'm terribly sorry I brought you along, Nikki. So, what time is it, by the way? How much time do we have? Oh, I forgot forever. What am I rushing for? Anyway, the other people say when they want to think badly of Dr. Adams, they say he doesn't answer Nick Adams' questions very efficiently at the end of the story. Some people are going to say, do ladies always have such a hard time having babies, Nick asked. No, that was very, very exceptional. Why did he kill himself, Daddy? I don't know, Nick. He couldn't stand things, I guess. Is that a good answer?
No, but an honest one.
Well, we have to remember that he's talking to a 5-year-old. Yeah, he's talking to a child. I don't know what people would expect Dr. Adams to say to a child. It seems to me that there's a fair amount of tenderness between father and son in this story. That in some respects, there's a lot of retrospective nostalgia for his closeness to his father and the affection they had. It seems to me that these are pretty good answers to things you would say to a 5-year-old, but this is kind of an astute 5-year-old. How many 5-year-olds use the word kill themselves? He didn't say suicide. That's an interesting question. And of course, where did Uncle George go? He took off. His brother says, he'll be back. Don't worry about him. I mean, Uncle George has missed the import of the whole story. Of all the people who stuck around to see this woman through her terrible situation, Who were they besides Dr. Adams? It's the Indian midwives. They were there, and it's interesting to note how people respond to these terrible moments. So this is quite an initiation for the young Nick Adams. He gets plunged into a gruesome life and death situation, and he gets to see all kinds of people in various stages of emotional distress and fear. The ending was great. This is a wonderful ending, and Hemingway worked very hard at ending stories. It's the beginning and the endings that are killers. Is dying hard, Daddy? No, I think it's pretty easy, Nick. It all depends. So this is not maybe the best answer, but I mean, what else can you say to a 5-year-old? And he's trying to diffuse the situation. All his post-operative comments are being made to try to give closure to the people that are there. And once he's done with his work, he talks to, he thinks about making arrangements for the mother. He deals with the father, and he tries to deal with the people, although he can't communicate with them. They were seated in the boat, Nick in the stern, his father rowing. The sun was coming up over the hills. A bass jumped, making a circle in the water. Nick trailed his hand in the water. It felt warm in the sharp chill of the morning. By the way, that was the original ending to the story. He stopped there. But Hemingway came back and added this last sentence. In the early morning on the lake, sitting in the stern of the boat with his father rowing, he felt quite sure that he would never die. I think that last sentence sort of tells you what Nick, at that moment, got out of the story. Now, as Nick Adams goes along, we'll see Nick Adams in his final story, I think 8 years later, the story called Fathers and Sons, when Nick Adams is grown up. He's now a father. He's an established writer, and he talks with great affection about his father, and he talks about the native peoples once again. And obviously, this is one of the many experiences that have made Nick Adams the adult who he is. But this moment, this last sentences tells us where Nick is at this moment. Remember, Nick has lost his enthusiasm for this some time ago. He's ended up being an intern. And he wasn't crazy about the job. But anyway, what does this say about Nick right there? This is not going to happen to me. This might happen to other people. But I'm not going to die.
Like most children, most young people.
Yeah.
They don't anticipate their death ever.
Yeah. And yeah, she says kids think of themselves as being immortal. And that's certainly true. So anyway, Nick this is something that he's going to be processing this for a long time. The questions he asks about people killing themselves, about the difficulties of childbirth, there's a lot that he has to work. Also, I'm always intrigued by the presence of the natural world. One of the things when we talk about the Nick Adams stories, and this one in particular, is there's very few metaphors in Hemingway, very few symbols, but I would like to suggest that perhaps the light is one. What kinds of lights do we have in this story? How are we doing for time, by the way? What time is it? Oh, we're doing good. Okay. The time there is light at the very beginning, and I was all
about the light on the trail because
yeah, the lantern. Yeah, the Indians they have enough light. They have plenty of light, and there's also the lamps in the doors of the shanties. And at the very end, dawn is happening, and a bass jumps up. It makes a circle in the water. There's always the salvation of the natural world, and this is the thing about the native peoples in these stories, is that they are the custodians. Their stance, their appreciation of the natural world is something that provides something that's very necessary to Nick. So if you ask the story, whose story is this? It's Nick Adams' story. And what does he need to know from the so-called primitive people? Well, this is probably the main answer, the refuge of the natural world. And the light of the sun, it's dawn, and it helps Nick. It's a new day. He's safe. A bass is jumping, making a nice circle in the water. So all is well. And he's with his dad, who cares for him. It wasn't so bad for him. Anyway, I decided, I thought we could, oop. Yeah, I'm gonna, my little, whatchamacallit here, my little microphone. Anyway, there's a lot to say, but I thought I would open this up a little bit. We have a few moments left. Do you have any questions for me? Yes, sir.
Well, the Nick Adams stories, as I understand it, were essentially autobiographical.
That's a very complicated question. He asks if they're autobiographical, or he says they are and they're not.
Well, I understand that, but the talk about taking your own life, there are a lot of connections.
That's a very important point. He mentions the theme of suicide. And what does this have to do with the author? After all, we all know when we read these last sentences that the real life models of both these people took their own lives. And the idea of suicide as a regular recurring theme, and when it's kind of like a ghost that haunts all of his fictions. In fact, the idea of a mental and emotional instability is kind of like a penumbra around all of his work. And the fact that both these characters, who presumably are rowing away happily, ended up doing what the Indian father himself did, that is, one of, to me, that's a true ghost effect. That's haunting. So this story has a haunting quality. As the shrinks say, they use the term suicide ideation, which is a fancy way of saying people think about it. When did this start for these people? And of course, the emotional problems that Dr. Adams had would be visited upon the son with the same kind of organic predispositions to manic depression and those sorts of emotional illnesses were very much a family thing. Now, of the Hemingway family, that was the mother, father, and 6 siblings. At least half of those people took their own lives. So this is a whole family that's haunted by this kind of darkness. So that's a great point, and that's something that you can't help but not think about. I mean, this is all, by the way, all of Hemingway's thematic material is in this story, in his very first Nick Adams story. At age 24, he managed to pack into this almost all the thematic content that he would ever write about. So, yeah, that's one thing, and then it's quite powerful. But anyway, my presentation today has been concerned with kind of refuting what I call the extinction narrative. I had a friend of mine, Tony Evans, who we talked about Indian camp. When I was meeting with him, and he said, I don't like this story at all. This is an awful story. And he was saying that he, as a native person, saw this as an extinction story. And I said, no. The Indians are elevated here. And the Indians, by the way, their plight, because of the very thing that you mentioned, is seen in universal terms. They just can't stand things, I guess. Well, the Indian father ends up as the precursor to the author and Dr. Adams. It's all linked up. Anyway, I don't know. I get, the more I read Hemingway, the more I get this feeling of these kinds of, it's like smoke filling up a room. It's that kind of insidious way in which all these issues are always present somehow in some way. And it is haunting. Yes, ma'am.
How long did it take Hemingway to go from the first Nick Adams story to the last? And how long between the last that he was so in passing?
Well, Nick Adams, the last was the question. You want me to repeat the question? Yeah. Our host today asked how long did the series last, and when did he complete it before his passing? The whole thing took about almost a decade, from about 1924 So the last one was in The Fathers and Sons, was written in 1933. So that's 9 years. He wrote the Nick Adams stories out of sequence. And a scholar, this guy, Philip Young, re-edited them and put them in sequence. And he also pulled in some Nick Adams material that remained unpublished. So we see the Nick Adams stories in chronology in a way that the early readers did not. And Hemingway didn't produce them that way. There's Nick as...
Did Hemingway ever publish the Nick Adams stories as stories, and then they were later put together?
She asks if did Hemingway present them chronologically. Hemingway worked Nick Adams in stories with his other fiction. He wrote Nick Adams short stories as he wrote his other short stories. And in his short story collections, he would sprinkle them in as he wrote them. And now Nick Adams starts as a child here, and we see him as an adult in his 30s in the final story. But it's not chronological at all. And he stopped writing Nick Adams stories by the mid-30s. And when it was a real change in his life when he wrote his famous African stories. But we'll see, we've got a couple more in our sequence here. The next one is about The Battler, which is Nick Adams as an adolescent. And then the famous one, probably one of the most famous short stories ever, is A Big Two-Hearted River, which is the culmination to his first short story sequence called In Our Time. And that one features Nick Adams covering the same ground that he covers in this story. Nick Adams, when he comes back from World War I, goes back to northern Michigan by himself and takes a camping trip over some of the very same territory. So that's an interesting way that he revisits these materials.